I was promised an Omega fit to stand beside me, not a scarred, hidden thing that cannot show her face. I would rather have no Luna than a ruined one. There you are.
Imagine spending your whole life hiding your face. Now imagine the one day you finally show it, is the day your own mate calls you unworthy in front of everyone you've ever known. For 18 years, Evelyn Ashbourne had exactly one rule: never let anyone see the scar. Not her reflection. Not her family. Not the servants who dressed her every morning with their eyes carefully, deliberately, elsewhere. She wore lace like armor. She learned silence like a second language. And she believed, the way you believe things drilled into you since childhood, that a mark on her face meant a mark on her worth. Today, she was supposed to become a bride. Today, she was supposed to finally be chosen. Instead, standing at the altar in front of the entire pack, her mate looked at her veiled face, and refused to lift it. He said he'd rather marry no one than look upon a scarred Omega. And as Evelyn stood there, alone, humiliated, veil still down, the chapel doors slammed open. The most feared Alpha in the kingdom walked in. He didn't ask permission. He didn't say a word. He lifted her veil himself. And what he saw on her face wasn't a curse. It was a secret 3 kingdoms had been searching for. I'm turning this into a full series. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when a rejected bride becomes a hunted queen. Drop where you're reading from in the comments. I read every single one and I'd love to say hi. The morning of her wedding, Evelyn Ashbourne sat before a mirror she had asked them not to give her. They gave it to her anyway. Tradition demanded it. A bride must see herself before she belongs to someone else. So she sat, veiled already, staring at the ghost of her own reflection through layers of ivory lace, and let her hands shake in her lap where no one could see them. She had been 7 years old when the attack happened. She remembered fragments more than the whole. Torchlight, the smell of smoke, a stranger's grip closing around her jaw, and pain that split her cheek open like something was trying to carve a message into her skin. She didn't remember screaming. Her nursemaid told her later that she hadn't made a sound, not once, not even after. What she remembered clearly, what she had never been able to unremember, was the year that followed. The whispers that trailed her through the halls of her own home. The other pups who flinched when she turned to face them, who called her broken thing and cursed and worse, in voices too young to know how much damage a word could do and too cruel to care. Her mother had covered every mirror in the house, not to protect Evelyn from her own reflection, but, Evelyn understood only years later, to protect herself from having to look at what had happened to her daughter. No Alpha wants a scarred Omega. She had heard that sentence so many times it had stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a fact of nature, as true and unchangeable as the moon rising each night. Today, that fact was supposed to change. Alpha Tristan Blackwood had agreed to take her as his mate, not for love, everyone understood that, but for the alliance between their packs. It wasn't romance. But Evelyn had let herself hope, quietly, foolishly, that it might become something close to acceptance. That if a man stood beside her long enough, the whispers might finally stop. A knock came at the door. Her attendant peered in, eyes darting to the veil and no further, the way everyone's eyes did. "It's time, my lady." Evelyn rose, smoothed the front of her gown, simple, vintage lace instead of the extravagant silks the other pack daughters wore, because simple was easier to hide behind, and walked toward the doors of the chapel with her hands folded tightly enough to stop their trembling. She told herself, one last time, that today might be the day someone finally looked at her and didn't look away. She was wrong. The chapel was full when the doors opened, every pack elder and noble family seated in rows of firelit gold, and for one suspended moment Evelyn let herself believe the day might go exactly as it was supposed to. She walked the aisle with her chin low, veil trembling with each breath, until she stood before Tristan Blackwood at the altar. He did not smile at her. He did not reach for her hands. He looked at the veil the way a man looks at a debt he no longer wishes to pay. The officiant began the binding words, and when the moment came, the moment every wedding turned on, the lifting of the veil, the first true look between mates, Tristan didn't move. "Alpha Blackwood," the officiant said gently, prompting him. Tristan's jaw tightened. And then, loud enough for the entire chapel to hear, he said the words that would follow Evelyn for the rest of her life. "I won't lift it." A ripple went through the guests, 100 indrawn breaths at once. "I was promised an Omega fit to stand beside me," Tristan continued, and now he wasn't looking at Evelyn at all, he was looking at the crowd, playing to them. "Not a scarred, hidden thing that can't even show her own face without shame. I won't claim her. I'd rather have no Luna than a ruined one." The words landed like physical blows. Evelyn felt her whole body go cold, then hot, then cold again, humiliation crawling up her throat until she thought she might be sick in front of everyone she had ever known. Somewhere behind her, she heard laughter, quiet, cruel, quickly muffled, and worse than the laughter were the murmurs that followed it, guests leaning toward each other with their hands half covering their mouths. "Told you the scar was a bad omen. Poor girl. Imagine being humiliated on your own wedding day. Better now than after the bond was sealed, I suppose." Evelyn stood frozen at the altar, veil still down, hands empty at her sides, and understood with a terrible clarity that this moment, this exact moment, in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to her, was the one her entire life had been building toward. Every mirror covered. Every lesson repeated. All of it had led here, to a chapel full of witnesses watching her be discarded like something faulty returned to a shop. She didn't cry. Not yet. She had promised herself years ago that she wouldn't give anyone that satisfaction, and some small, stubborn part of her clung to that promise even now, even as her throat burned and her vision blurred behind the lace. Tristan turned from her without another word and walked back down the aisle, and no one stopped him. No one spoke up for her. The silence that followed his exit was almost worse than his cruelty. A silence that said, clearly, that the whole room agreed with him, that they were only sorry the scandal hadn't stayed contained a little longer. That was when the chapel doors, already closed behind Tristan's retreat, opened again. This time, no one whispered. The Alpha King had never once, in living memory, attended a minor Pax wedding. His presence alone would have stopped every heart in the room. But it was the way he moved that made the silence total, absolute, a held breath stretched across every pew. Cassian Draven walked down the aisle the way a storm moves across open water, unhurried and entirely certain of where it was going. He was tall enough that his shadow reached the altar before he did. Black armor caught the candlelight in sharp, cold lines, and the wolf fur mantle across his shoulders gave him the silhouette of something out of an old story. The kind told to frighten children into obedience. His face gave away nothing. It never did. That was, the whispers said, exactly why every northern pack feared him more than they feared war itself, because you could never tell what the Alpha King was thinking until it was already too late to stop it. Evelyn watched him come through the blur of unshed tears, too stunned to move, too humiliated to run. Every eye in the chapel had shifted from her ruined wedding to him, grateful, she thought bitterly, for something else to look at. He didn't stop at a polite distance. He walked until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to keep her eyes somewhere near his, though she still couldn't make herself hold his gaze. "My king," she managed, voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't." "Look at me," he said. Not a command shouted for the room. Quiet. Meant only for her. She didn't. Years of instinct kept her eyes down, kept her shoulders curled inward, kept her bracing for whatever unkindness would come next, because in her experience unkindness always came next. Cassian reached up. The whole chapel seemed to inhale at once. No one touched an Omega's veil uninvited, not before the mate bond, not ever, unless they intended a claim so absolute there would be no undoing it. Evelyn felt his fingers find the edge of the lace, felt the fabric lift away from her face slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted every single person behind him to see exactly what he was doing and understand it could not be taken back. The veil fell away. Cold air touched her scarred cheek for the first time in front of a crowd since she was 7 years old. Evelyn braced herself for the reaction she had spent her whole life anticipating, the recoil, the disgust, the sharp intake of breath that meant someone had finally, truly seen her. It didn't come. Cassian Draven looked at her scar the way he might have looked at a mark of honor. His expression, famous for never changing, changed. Something in the hard line of his jaw eased. Something behind his eyes, cold as northern winter a moment ago, warmed by exactly 1 degree, enough that Evelyn, who had spent her entire life reading faces for the first sign of rejection, knew instantly that what she was seeing was real. "There you are," he said, so quietly it felt like it belonged only to the two of them, though every soul in the chapel heard it anyway. Evelyn's breath caught. "My king, I don't. You are not ruined." His voice carried now, deliberate, meant for the crowd behind him this time. "You are not cursed. You are not unworthy of anyone in this room, least of all the man who just proved himself unworthy of you." A murmur went through the guests, uncertain, disbelieving. Cassian didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Evelyn, on the tears finally slipping free down her scarred cheek, and something in his expression looked almost like reverence. "If no alpha in this chapel recognizes what you are," he said, "then I will." And then, in front of the entire pack, in front of nobles who had spent a lifetime teaching Evelyn to be ashamed of her own face, the Alpha King of every northern territory lowered himself to 1 knee before her. The gasp that went through the chapel was audible enough to rattle the stained glass. "Alpha Draven, please, stand," Evelyn's voice shook. This wasn't how kings behaved. This wasn't how anyone had ever behaved toward her. "I've searched a long time for a face like yours," Cassian said, rising only when he chose to, not because propriety demanded it. "Longer than you know. And I did not come here today to watch you stand alone in a room full of people too small to deserve you." "You don't know me," Evelyn whispered. "No," he agreed. "But I intend to. And I offer you the protection of my crown while I do, not as a debt, not as pity. As a right you were always owed and never given." Behind him, the pack elders had begun whispering urgently to one another, and somewhere in the chapel Evelyn heard Tristan's name spoken with something new in it, not scorn for her, this time, but a flicker of alarm for himself. She barely registered it. She was looking at Cassian Draven, at the first face in 18 years that hadn't flinched from hers, and something long buried and long starved inside her chest cracked open like ice giving way to spring. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand, not a command, an invitation, and somehow that distinction mattered more to her than anything else that had happened that day. "Let them whisper. Let them wonder. You will never again have to hide behind lace in a room that doesn't deserve to see you." Evelyn looked down at his outstretched hand, then up at the guests who had laughed at her not 10 minutes before, now silent, now watching her with something that almost resembled fear of their own judgment. She placed her hand in his. The Moon Palace was nothing like the modest halls Evelyn had grown up in. Its towers rose pale and sharp against the northern sky, wolves carved into every archway, silver veins running through black stone like frost across glass. She arrived still in her wedding gown, veil discarded somewhere behind her in a chapel 3 days' ride south, and every servant who passed her in the corridor looked at her scarred cheek with open, unhidden curiosity. She braced herself for cruelty. It didn't come from the servants. It came, instead, from the nobles. They gathered in small clusters along the palace's great hall the following evening, dressed in furs and silver, watching Evelyn the way hunters watch a wounded animal wander too close to the pack. She heard their voices even when they thought she couldn't. The king brought home a rejected bride, one noblewoman murmured, not quite quietly enough. A scarred Omega, no less. Has he lost his senses? He's the Alpha King, another replied. He can do as he pleases. Doesn't mean the rest of us have to accept her. Evelyn kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, the way she had trained herself to do for 18 years, though the old shame still curled tight and familiar in her stomach. She had thought, foolishly, that leaving her old pack behind might mean leaving the Whispers behind too. She understood now that Whispers followed wherever she went, only the faces changed, never the cruelty behind them. What was different, this time, was that when Cashin entered the hall and found her standing alone beneath the weight of a dozen judging stares, he crossed the room without hesitation and stood beside her, not in front of her, not shielding her like something fragile, beside her, the way a mate stood beside a mate. They'll learn, he said, low enough that only she could hear. Learn what? He looked at her, and for the second time that week, something behind his ice-colored eyes warmed. That the mark they've spent your whole life calling a curse is the very thing that will decide whether this kingdom survives what's coming. Evelyn's stomach turned over. What do you mean? But Cashin only turned back toward the watching nobles, his expression unreadable once more, and said nothing further. Leaving Evelyn standing in a palace full of wolves who did not want her there, with a scar on her cheek that suddenly felt less like an old wound and more like the first page of a secret no one had told her she was carrying. The ceremony of the long moon came a fortnight later, the one night each year when every pack in the north gathered beneath the palace's great open dome to renew their oaths to the crown. Evelyn had not wanted to attend. She had spent 2 weeks feeling the weight of the nobles' stares settle over her like a second veil, and the thought of standing beneath moonlight in front of all of them, scar bare, felt like walking back into that chapel all over again. Cashin had asked her anyway, gently, the way he asked things now that surprised her every time, not as a king issuing a command but as someone leaving room for her to say no. She hadn't said no. Some stubborn, still healing part of her wanted to stop hiding, even if she didn't yet believe she deserved to stop. The dome opened to a clear sky, full moon hanging low and silver over the assembled packs. Evelyn stood near the dais in a gown the color of frost, no veil this time, her scar bare to the night air, and told herself she could survive an hour of being looked at. The oaths began. Elders came forward one by one to kneel before Cashin, murmuring the old words, and Evelyn watched with her hands folded tightly in front of her, trying not to notice how many eyes kept drifting to her instead of the king. Then the moonlight shifted. It was subtle at first, a warmth on her cheek that had nothing to do with the cool night air, a faint prickling beneath her scar like sunlight after a long winter. Evelyn lifted her hand to her face without thinking, and gasped when her fingers came away and the warmth remained, stronger now, spreading. Someone screamed. She turned toward the nearest polished surface, a silver ceremonial basin catching the moon, and saw her own reflection for the first time in longer than she could remember without flinching from it. Her scar was glowing. Not fire, not injury. A soft, silver luminescence tracing the exact line of the old wound, pulsing gently in time with her heartbeat, bright enough that every face in the dome turned toward her at once. The oath-giving elder froze mid-sentence. Cashin rose from the dais so fast his chair scraped against stone. "It can't be," someone near the front whispered, and the words rippled outward through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. "The moon brand. That's the moon brand." Evelyn stood frozen, glowing scar and all, 18 years of shame crashing directly into something she had no name for. "What's happening to me?" Cashin was already at her side, and when he looked at her this time, there was no surprise in his face at all, only something that looked, horribly, like vindication. "It's finally shown itself," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I hoped. I didn't know." "Cashin. Your mark isn't a wound, Evelyn." His hands closed gently over her shoulders, steadying her as the entire dome erupted into stunned, disbelieving noise around them. "It's a bloodline. The moon brand hasn't appeared in this kingdom in over 200 years. Whatever came next, Evelyn understood with sick, dizzying certainty, would unmake everything she had ever believed about the worst day of her childhood. The elders convened that same night, and by morning Cassian had summoned the one man in the kingdom old enough to remember the last recorded moon brand, a retired archivist named Corwin, half-blind and slow-moving, who arrived at the palace clutching a leather-bound record older than the throne itself. The mark passes through the first Luna's bloodline, Corwin explained, spreading brittle pages across the table while Evelyn sat rigid beside Cassian, still not fully believing any of it applied to her. It only manifests under moonlight, and only in a true descendant. Which means, my lady, that whoever attacked you as a child knew exactly what you were. The room went very still. It wasn't a random attack, Cassian said slowly, and Evelyn watched something dark settle behind his eyes. Someone tried to kill a child because of what her bloodline threatened. Evelyn's hands had gone cold in her lap. She had spent 18 years believing the worst night of her life was senseless cruelty, a monster acting without reason, and some part of her had almost preferred that, because senseless cruelty didn't mean anyone had wanted her dead on purpose. "Do you know who," she asked, voice barely steady, "ordered it?" Corwin hesitated, glancing at Cassian before answering. "The attack happened the same season your family's pact signed a border alliance with the Blackwoods. If someone wanted to prevent the old bloodline from ever reaching the throne, he didn't need to finish." Evelyn felt the name rise in her own throat before anyone said it aloud. "Tristan," she whispered. "Not Tristan," Cassian said grimly, already rising, already moving toward the door with the controlled fury of a man who had waited a long time for a reason. "His father." The proof, when it came quickly. A steward who had served the Blackwood Pack for 30 years and finally, faced with the Alpha King's questioning, broke his silence out of guilt he'd apparently carried since Evelyn was 7 years old. He told them everything. How old Alpha Blackwood had learned, through channels no one else knew existed, that a child bearing the mark of the first Luna had been born into a minor pack nearby. How he'd feared what it meant for his own family's ambitions if that bloodline was ever recognized and raised to power. How he'd sent men not to kill her outright, cowardice, even then, but to scar her badly enough that no one would ever look closely enough to notice what she truly was. It had worked, in its way, for 18 years. Tristan was summoned before the court within the week, dragged from whatever quiet corner he'd retreated to since his humiliation at the altar, and made to stand in the same great hall where the nobles had once whispered about Evelyn's ruin. This time, every whisper was aimed at him. "You didn't know," Evelyn said to him, once the accusations had been laid bare and the room had gone silent waiting for her to speak. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the sick, hollow look on his face. He truly hadn't known, not the full truth of it, only that his father had never wanted the marriage to happen and had never told him why. "I rejected the one thing that could have saved my family's reputation," Tristan said hoarsely, "because I thought your scar made you weak." "No," Evelyn said, and for the first time in her life, her voice didn't shake when she said it. "You rejected me because you were taught the same lie I was taught. That a mark means unworthiness." She looked at him a long moment, not with hatred, only with a tired kind of clarity. "The difference is, I finally know it isn't true." The court stripped the Blackwood Pack of its titles within the month. Evelyn didn't ask what became of Tristan's father. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer needed to know in order to feel free of him. What she needed, instead, was time. To sit with the archivist's brittle old pages, to trace her own bloodline back through names she'd never been told, to understand that the scar she had spent 18 years hiding was the last living thread of the first Luna's line, waiting all this time to be recognized. Cassian gave her that time without once rushing her toward the throne. He simply stayed close, steady, patient in a way nothing in her old life had ever been, and slowly Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "I used to think this mark ruined me," she told him one evening, standing at the tall windows of the palace with moonlight pooling silver across the stone floor. "Now I think it's the only reason I'm still standing." It never ruined you, Cashin said. It only waited for you to stop believing what other people told you about yourself. Evelyn turned to face him, chin lifted, the old instinct to look away nowhere in sight. Then I'm done waiting too. The kingdom gathered beneath the long moon dome one final time, packs from every territory filling the stone steps in numbers the palace hadn't seen in a generation, drawn by rumors that had traveled faster than any royal messenger could have managed on his own. They came to see the girl with the glowing scar. They came to see whether the stories were true. Evelyn walked to the dais without a veil. She had worn one every day of her life until 3 weeks ago, had built her entire understanding of herself around the necessity of hiding, and standing now in front of thousands of watching faces, she felt something she never expected to feel in a moment like this. Steady. Cashin waited for her at the top of the dais, the ancient circlet of the first Luna resting on a cushion of dark velvet beside him. Recovered, Corwin had told her, from a vault sealed 2 centuries ago, waiting all that time for a bloodline someone had once tried very hard to erase. Evelyn Ashbourne, Cashin said, and his voice carried across the silent dome without needing to be raised, will you stand before this kingdom as what you are, without apology, without concealment, for the rest of your days? I will, Evelyn said, and her voice did not shake. He lifted the circlet and placed it over her dark hair, and the moment the silver touched her brow, her scar began to glow again, brighter this time, steadier, no longer a startled flicker but something that looked, to every watching face in that dome, unmistakably like a crown of its own. A murmur swept through the crowd. Not cruelty this time. Not whispered cruelty at all. Awe. One by one, beginning with the elders who had once called her mark a curse, the packs of the north began to kneel. It moved through the crowd like wind through wheat, hundreds and then thousands of bodies lowering to the stone, until the only 2 people left standing beneath the full moon were Cashin and his queen. Evelyn looked out over a kingdom that had spent her entire life teaching her to be ashamed, now bowed low before the very thing they'd once told her to hide, and felt 18 years of buried grief finally, quietly, let go. Cashin took her hand, and this time when their eyes met, there was nothing guarded left in either of them. Rise as my equal, he said, low enough that it was meant only for her, not because I lifted your veil. Because you were always meant to stand without one. Evelyn Ashbourne, the last daughter of the first Luna, the girl once called broken by everyone who never bothered to truly look at her, lifted her chin beneath the full moon and let the whole kingdom see her face at last.